Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today in this panel about political extremism, political populism. Today we have Dr. Sahar Khamis, who is an expert on Arab and Muslim media. She's a former head of the Mass Communication and Information Science Department in Qatar University. She's also a former Mellon Islamic Studies Initiative visiting professor at the University of Chicago. Dr. Khamis is the author of various books as well as numerous articles. She is a member of the editorial boards of several journals in the field of communication in general and the field of Arab and Muslim media in particular. She's also a media commentator and analyst, a public speaker, a human rights commissioner in the Human Rights Commission in Montgomery County, Maryland, and a radio host who presents a monthly radio show, U.S. Arab Radio, which is the first Arab American radio station broadcasting in the U.S. and Canada. We also have Mr. Randall Fowler, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research examines U.S. foreign policy concerning the Middle East with a particular focus on the ways in which presidents, government officials, and other figures that depict the region in public discourse, justify military interventions, and articulate norms of sovereignty and responsibility. I will stop there and I will now pass the floor to our speakers.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this kind and generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to participate and take part in the Middle East Dialogue Conference annually. Of course, last year, unfortunately, we were not able to have a conference because of the pandemic. This year, we're having a virtual conference. Hopefully, next year, we're going to have a in-person, face-to-face conference, as we always do in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much. Without further ado, I'll just say that we are presenting today myself and my co-author, Randall Fowler, from the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park, on the topic of comparing Arab and American populism. We're going to talk about the parallels, the rhetorical parallels, as well as the authoritarian divergences or differences between the Arab and American context in the realm of populism. Our talk today is going to consist of different parts. The outline or the agenda for the talk briefly is we're going to start with the definitions and traditions of populism. We're going to move on to talk about the context of populism in the Arab versus the American context. We'll give a special context about the Arab Spring, cyber activism, mass protest movements in the context of the Arab world. We'll move on to talk about the context in the American realm, in particular, the populism of former President Donald Trump and what it meant. And we'll also talk about the rhetorical parallels and paradoxes in both the American and the Arab context. So I hand it over to Randall at this point.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for being here. So our study is interested in bringing together two streams of scholarship and commentary that have been happening over the past decade or so. And so on one hand, we have the global rise of populism. This is something that's been commented on endlessly, both in journalistic media and also in scholarship. From 2015 on, we've seen lots of movements across Europe and North America. So in Europe, we have the National Front Party. In France, we have Brexit, obviously, the British decision to leave the European Union, which has been talked about as a populist movement, the rise of Alternative for Germany party in Germany, and then we have the Law and Justice Party in Poland. Obviously, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and then even in Austria, we saw an electoral breakthrough for a populist party. So across Europe, and then of course in North America, we have the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and in South America as well, and in Latin America, we have the elections in Brazil and Mexico. All of these different disparate movements have been sort of generalized as a global rise of populism and a global wave of populism. However, a lot of these discussions tend to leave out the Middle East. And so when we're thinking about the Middle East and we're thinking about populism across continents, it's important also to put these movements into conversation with developments in the Arab world specifically. So we see the rise of authoritarianism and political protest in the post-Arab Spring Middle East. We've seen lots of events in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Algeria, Lebanon, Sudan, elsewhere. There's lots of different movements we could talk about. But in general, what we're focusing on here is trying to put these two things into conversation. If we've seen the rise of mass protests, in the Arab world. And we've also seen the rise of populist movements and counter movements within the Western world, considering the Americas and Europe. Then we should sort of think through how these relate to each other. And that's the general project that we're going with here. So first, we need to define what populism is before we can talk about exactly how populism might manifest across these different cultural contexts and regions. So there's one cluster of definitions surrounding populism that seeks to identify it with a particular historical movement. Obviously, the Russian Narodnichevskoye movement in the 1860s started around 1861. I'm obviously not an expert in this movement, but following the emancipation of the serfs, you have a description of the Russian people that's sort of identified by some scholars as the sort of populist movement. Then we have the US Populist Party led by William Jennings Bryan in the 1890s, challenged the Republicans under William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. In Latin America, we have multiple waves of populism, depending on which scholar you're looking at, from the 1930s, the 1960s, and the 1990s, and some, again, would argue that 2015 constituted another wave of populism there. Many scholars in the United States were interested in the rise of populism, and it rose as a term in scholarly literature following McCarthyism in the United States in the 1950s. And so there's a cluster of scholars that try to identify a particular subset of the US population that was populist. That was the audience for Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare appeals. And then obviously we have Donald Trump and related movements in the Republican Party over the past few decades. So there's this move to try to identify populism with the historical movement. There are also those who would define populism ideologically. And so J.B. Alcock in 1971 offered one such definition. He argued that populism exists where there is, quote, popular resentment against the order imposed by society by a long-established, differentiated ruling class, which is believed to have a monopoly of power, property, breeding, and culture. And so what Alcock points out in this definition is that populism is something that exists cross-culturally, and it exists in different contexts, and it's a form of popular resentment that seeks to target what is believed to be a ruling class. And again, the advantages of the ruling class under Alcock's definition manifest themselves through property, breeding, culture, power, different forms of cultural capital, so to speak, and literal capital, financial capital. And then there are others, Lara Graton here, who define populism as not necessarily a negative thing. So under her definition, she writes, contra those like Alcock, radical democratic actors, from grassroots revolutionaries to insurgent farmers and laborers to agitators for the New Deal, civil rights, and the New Left, have historically drawn on the language and practices of populism. They have cultivated people's rebellious aspirations not just to resist power, but to share power, and to do so in pluralistic, egalitarian ways across social and geographic borders. And so there's lots of different definitions ideologically for populism. Lara Graton's definition, she's interested in sort of plumbing how populism might offer resources for the masses to resist neoliberal formations of financial and political power. Not all of these definitions are necessarily negative. Some of these definitions are positive. But ultimately, what we try to do is sidestep these debates in this project. We're not so much interested in trying to define populism ideologically and saying it must be a belief system or some sort of political mode of thought organized around these different tenets. We're also not necessarily interested in it as a historical movement or a particular sociological group. What we're interested in is studying populism as a political style. And so we're following Harriman's 1995 book on that subject. We're focusing on the referent, the people, right? We're interested in how leaders, whether they are elected leaders, those who are in opposition, or simply public figures, define the people, configure the people in discourse, and then account for and configure the people's relationship to themselves as political figures, and also to the other, whether that's an elite or a foreign foe or some sort of oppositional group against which the people have been set. And so, following Rolf and Lee, we're interested in accounting for the, quote, chameleonic qualities, we love that quote, of populism, noting that it's a slippery term with no fixed meaning or ideology. Again, because populism is, if it is an ideology, it's a thin ideology, it's difficult to locate exactly what it means. And so this way of approaching populism allows us again to focus on the discourse. And as communication scholars, that's what we're all about. So, If populism has these contested definitions, we agree that populism is a political style. Well, what does that actually mean? So number one, it means paying attention to appeals to the people versus the elite. So we are particularly interested in ways in which political leaders articulate themselves as representatives of the people set against some sort of elite. And as we'll talk about later in this presentation, that's something that's particular to the American context, but is something that translates across borders to some extent as well. It also means the expression of bad manners. What this means is breaking with decorum or typical ways of political speech. So we saw this in particular with Donald Trump, where he would tend to not necessarily speak respectfully of other people, where he would a lot of times try to provoke the media or provoke who he perceives as his political opponents. Bad manners can extend to a wide range of things, but essentially it gets at the idea that they're trying to break whatever norms there are in terms of conversation and political discourse so that it gets attention, so that it focuses, again, the public eyeballs on them. And then, of course, a sense of crisis, breakdown, or threat. A third component of understanding populism as a political style is understanding that it's a type of motif that gets rearticulated, right? The Flight 93 election in 2016 is a great example. Michael Anton's essay describing the 2016 election as a plane that's about to crash, right? So through a metaphor, he's communicating that there's a sense of crisis and we must act now, otherwise we're going to lose the country, so to speak. This is something that appears also in political leaders' discourse. So just to sum up quickly, we adhere to populism as a political style for this study. We pay attention to that because we are communication scholars interested in the discourse, how political leaders configure themselves as representatives of the people and their relationship to the people through their rhetoric. Components of populism as a political style, as Moffat points out, have these three components. So appeals to the people versus elite, bad manners, and some sort of escalation. Okay, so if that's what populism means, here's several different American traditions. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but there's a lot of different groups that could be labeled as populists. So historically, even the anti-federalists under Jefferson, whenever the country first had political parties, right? We had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You know, if you want to go watch Hamilton, that might clue you in a little bit on that. But again, we have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists sort of hold up the agrarian ideal of the yeoman farmer as sort of the quintessential member of the new American Republic. We have the Jacksonian Democrats against John Quincy Adams, and obviously many Democrats after Andrew Jackson defined themselves as, again, representatives of the people against some sort of elite. The Know Nothings Party, I like this flag of the Know Nothings Party because they describe themselves as the Native Americans who were set against foreign influence, right, within the country's first century of being. And then the Populist Party, like we mentioned, with William Jennings Bryan. And then in the 20th century, we have various populist movements within the United States. So we have, obviously, what we talked about with McCarthy, but some people would argue that figures like FDR or others, or other more left-wing figures, more liberal, not necessarily left-wing in the grand spectrum, but left-wing within American politics, would be considered populist as well. And so, again, through all of these different traditions, one major theme that we notice comes through is that all of these groups tended to focus on an internal group that they described as an elite or some sort of opponent of the people. So in the American tradition, one of the most important trends that we noticed whenever we started studying this was that there's this tendency to focus on groups internal to the nation. So the Populist Party, the Jacksonian Democrats, 20th century movements aren't necessarily fixating on a foreign foe. They're talking about a group within American society that they think is subverting the will of the people, and they as the political figures are going to represent the will of the people against that minority interest. So that's what populism in the American traditions looks like to some extent. Donald Trump, of course, has been defined as a nationalist populist. And so for him, he's, again, running in this tradition of focusing on internal foes. And for him, the internal foe is the establishment. His chant, "Drain the swamp," during the 2016 election was something that we heard a lot during his rallies. He's also someone who tends to be an authoritarian rhetorical style. Again, we're not necessarily talking about his actual governance, although Trump did obviously as a someone who inhabited the presidency post, the George W. Bush administration, as someone who we could characterize as a quote unquote imperial president. But again, he had an authoritarian rhetorical style. By that we mean that he tended to portray himself as this powerful leader, ordering others to do things. At different points, he claimed absolute power, and he had lots of different moments where he asserted his authority. And then nativism as well. This is something that ran throughout Trump's rhetoric, especially in the 2016 election, but appeals to ethnic majorities over and against the interests of ethnic minorities. So Trump is considered a nationalist populist within this paradigm. And again, in the US tradition, there tends to be a focus on internal foes. And now Dr. Khamis is going to talk about what this looks like in the Arab context.
Thank you, Randall, for this great introduction and for putting us in the frame and the context of the rhetorical definitions of populism, historical context as well, and also explaining it to us in the context or the realm of American politics. Now, I want to move to the Arab context, and let's try to see what could be some of the parallels, what could be some of the divergences, the similarities, and the differences with everything that Randall has just explained now. We talk about here Arab nationalist traditions, and one important moment and one important figure in this Arab nationalist tradition, and also in the tradition of populism in the Arab context, is definitely former President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Abdel Nasser has been a very important key figure in this realm because he started this whole idea of Nasserism and the idea of Arab nationalism, al-Qawmiyya al-Arabiyya. Arab nationalism is based on this idea of having quote unquote external enemies or external foes. So Randall talked about the American populism focusing on the concept of the internal foes or the internal enemies, the concept of the people versus the elite. In the Arab context, we can talk about playing the people against external foes or external enemies. And in the case of Nasser, for example, his rhetoric focused on anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-Zionism, building a new socialist movement. Also, he started this tradition of talking about the people, al-Sha'b, and pretty much really focusing on the idea that he was the first quote-unquote president who is actually Egyptian, because all the previous rulers from the royal family were not Egyptian. So he started this tradition of, I am from you, I am from the people, I am one of the people. And he started to really kind of use this kind of rhetoric to try to identify himself as one of the people, but to also kind of raise this whole notion of the people or the Egyptian people versus external foes and external enemies. A very important point here is the use of the media. During, of course, Nasser's era, he played a very important role in terms of recruiting some important figures in newspapers, as well as also the start of television in 1960, the start of the Voice of the Arabs or Sawt al-Arab, a radio station, was also at the time of Nasser. So this whole role of the media, when he started to use the media as important vehicles or important tools to reach the people through an important editor like Muhammad Hassanin Haikal in newspapers, television started during his reign in 1960, which became a very important vehicle for him to reach the people. He started Sawt al-Arab or Voice of the Arabs radio station. These were very important tools for him to drum up or to play up his populist rhetoric, which started to resonate far-reaching and wide outreach throughout the Arab region with leaders, like Qaddafi and Assad and Mubarak afterwards, playing the same drum or playing the same tune of populism, which was started by Nasser and Nasserism. So when we talk about populist rhetoric versus the protest, that's a very important theme. Populists and protesters both claim to speak on behalf of the people. So whether you are a populist leader, whether you are a protester or an activist, your theme is you are doing this for the people, al-Sha'b. The appropriation of the theme of the people is a very important theme. We saw that, for example, in the 2011 revolution in Egypt, when we saw, for example, the theme of al-Jaysh wa al-Sha'b eid wahda. The military is trying to say, we and the people are the same. We are one hand. And then in my second book, Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, myself and my co-author, Muhammad Nawawi, talked about some of the bloggers, like, for example, Michael Nabil, who was arrested because he actually had a post on one of his blogs that said, Al-Sha'b wal-Jaysh were never one hand. The people and the military were never one hand. So this whole notion of who speaks on behalf of the people is a very important factor to consider when we talk about populism in the Arab realm. Populist rhetoric as counter argument as well. Like you can build an argument, I am for the people, I am with the people, and I can build a counter argument. No, you're not. Just like the post I just mentioned now from Michael Nabil saying the people and the military were never one hand. Basically, you are something and we are something else. So speaking on behalf of the people or aside from the people or different from the people is a very important thing to remember and to bear in mind when we talk about building these arguments and counter arguments. Speaking of this whole tug of war, I like to think of it as a tug of war, as some kind of tension between the populists and the protesters. Also, it was deployed by populist leaders in power when faced with mass protests. So whenever there's a mass protest or an outbreak of a revolution or an uprising, the leaders in power, the populist leaders will say, wait a minute, we are the ones who speak on behalf of the people, not you. That's a very important thing, the appropriation of this theme or this term, the people or الشعب. So in the context of cyber wars and cyber activism, that is something, of course, I've been pretty much writing on for a long time now, since the beginning of the Arab Spring uprisings back in 2011. That has been one of the major areas of my research focus. When we talk about the political conditions after the Arab Spring, fast forward 10 years after the moment of euphoria that swept everyone during the Arab Spring moment. Oh, this is going to be a huge, change for democratization and reform. And really, we're going to have this kind of, it's an Arab Spring, right? So there is this theme or this hope of reform and democratization. Fast forward, of course, 10 years to 2021, we clearly see a derailing of democratization in many of these quote unquote post-Arab Spring countries, with the unique exception of Tunisia. So what we saw is renewed authoritarianism in many countries. There's a continued dissatisfaction with political freedoms and political reform in the region. Many of these countries are completely in a mess now. And for example, you have a civil war in Syria, you have sectarian strife in Libya, you have a war in Yemen, and so on. So responses to these different conditions, there is an increased cyber activism among democratic activists. There is collaborations, networking, there is virtual assembly, there is documentation, there is trying to mobilize people on the ground. And I always say it's very important to remember two things here. Number one, we need to really build what we call the middle ground of cyber realism. We don't want to be, cyber optimistic or cyber pessimistic. In other words, we don't want to overcredit or to undercredit social media, or to overestimate or underestimate the role of social media. It has always been, quote unquote, the people on the ground who are actually the ones who can create this kind of reform or this kind of change whenever they decide to do so and in whichever way they decide to do so. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. We are now shifting from the realm of techno-euphoria to the realm of what we can call digital authoritarianism. Digital authoritarianism meaning the regimes are also building their own learning curve, they're learning their lessons, they're trying to take charge, both online and offline, in going after their own opponents and the people who are opposing them, whether online or offline, in very sophisticated ways that did not exist back in 2011, when many of these regimes were taken by surprise and they panicked and they did not know how to react. In our co-authored paper, Arab Resistance in the Diaspora, that myself and my co-author Randall Fowler have published in Journal of Arab and Muslim Media Research, we talked about this interesting phenomena of cyber activism abroad. When people are faced with this kind of digital authoritarianism and authoritarianism on the ground as well, the only option for them is to resist from the diaspora. They have to go abroad, they have to go overseas, and that is the case with many of the opponents of these regimes, these autocratic and authoritarian regimes. We focused in particular on the cases of two particular young men, the Saudi Arabian blogger Omar Abdulaziz and the Egyptian whistleblower Muhammad Ali, and we talked about how they are just two examples among many of how they are trying to actually create new messages and trying to use social media and cyber activism from the diaspora to try to make their messages heard and to reach to the people, again, the concept of the people inside their own home countries. But they have very different styles. Our paper talked about, for example, how Muhammad Ali was talking about a revolution. He wanted to kind of mobilize people on the ground to actually take action, to go out to the street to protest, while the Saudi blogger Omar Abdulaziz was more about reform. So he was discussing things related to rights, human rights, women's rights, basically pushing the envelope a little bit, while Muhammad Ali, the whistleblower, was talking about revolution, action on the ground, protest, mobilization, and democracy, and the need to shift to a democracy. So they had different styles. They were both trying to appeal to the people in their own way, but in different styles and different techniques. So the battles over the people, obviously it's an ongoing battle. The Arab Spring is just one point of reference, but it's not exclusively the only point. I always like to highlight this particular angle and this particular point because people talk about, yeah, the Arab Spring. And I'm like, yes, but there were actually movements on the ground way before the eruption of the Arab Spring in 2011. It was a very important historic moment, that's for sure. There's no question about it. But it was not the first moment or the only moment. Way before the eruption of the Arab Spring movements, there were forms of activism and popular mobilization on the ground. The only thing is they were on a limited scale, and the government would find it easy to actually, take hold of these 200, 300 protesters and put them in jail behind bars. What happened in 2011 was this combination of online and offline. So you have the cyber activism online and you have on the ground mobilization in real life. And when you have this merge of both of these forms, you get a very strong momentum that helps to kind of flare up or boost or mobilize these battles over the people and reaching out to the people. This is also ongoing in the American context, of course, where we see the left and the right wing populisms and the right wing and left wing protests that have been taking place as well in the American context. So the context of battles over the people are not starting and ending with the Arab Spring in 2011. As I said, we actually find echoes of many of these protests in a number of Arab countries. In Egypt, for example, in September 2019, there were some limited protests that erupted in Cairo and in some rural areas and some remote areas in Egypt as well. They were not on the same scale, definitely, of 2011, not even close. And as I said before, the regimes built their own learning curves, meaning they learned the lesson of how to try to curb public mobilization and how to try to contain public protest. They're building the learning curve online in terms of increased cyber activism and cracking down on protesters and activists online. And they're also building the curve in terms of cracking down on them on the ground through increased security measures and imprisonments and arrests, you name it. But that still shows that there is some kind of ripple effect or some kind of snowballing effect from the Arab Spring movements. The next, please. We also saw the protests in Lebanon that started in October 2019, and they are actually continuing until the present. So these protests in Lebanon, of course, over certain economic measures, over corruption, anti-corruption protests, and protests trying to actually kind of shake some of the status quo elements in Lebanon, to talk about corruption, to try to reform some of the very severe and dire economic conditions, to put the government in check, and to create a higher degree of accountability, started in October 2019 and are still continuing to some degree or another up till this moment. And next, please. We also saw the teachers' protests in Jordan that started in 2020. And I would like to reference here other protests also that broke up in the Arab world, including the protests in Algeria and the protests in Sudan. These have been very important and very impactful movements on the ground as well. They continued week after week, month after month, with very strong momentum and with a lot of pressure on the regimes. Only in the case of Sudan, of course, we saw the actual change in the head of the regime, al-Bashir. In the other countries, we saw this kind of momentum on the ground that's really building up and continuing, telling us that the battles over the people are still pretty much alive and well. They're pretty much continuing on the ground as well as online. And while the regimes are building the learning curve with more quote unquote digital authoritarianism online, as well as more strict measures, security measures, and more repressive measures in real life and on the ground, the protesters and activists are also having their own dynamic mobilization on the ground and their own momentum in terms of fueling or trying to boost these forms of mobilization and movements throughout different parts of the Arab world. So it's not a story that started and ended with the 2011 Arab Spring moment, as I said before.
Certainly. And again, to reiterate, this is something that happens both physically and online, in cyber and in real life. And so this is something that we saw, again, to extend the context back to the United States. We saw lots of battles over the people during the Trump presidency. So the Women's March on Washington, D.C. is one quintessential example of this. There were estimated 3 to 4 million people taking to the streets to, again, protest the election of Donald Trump. And again, if you look at even the Wikipedia page for protests during Donald Trump's presidency, it's very, very long. So there's been people who, again, got together, marched, organized protests, lots of different online and offline modes of resisting President Trump, and even with the moniker the resistance, and organizing in a way to voice popular discontent. Again, because Trump is a nationalist populist in terms of his rhetoric, this was an attempt to sort of see that tug of war playing out, where President Trump claimed to speak on behalf of the people, and the protesters claimed also to speak on the behalf of the people. And we saw this tug of war play out over the course of his presidency, both in person and online. We would also be remiss if we didn't talk about right-wing populism as well. And we saw lots of assemblies, especially early on in Trump's presidency. The Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017 is the example that comes to mind for a lot of people, because that was the example that took place just a few miles south here of Washington, D.C. And it also led to several deaths during the counter protests. And so we saw protesters from the right, protesters who are against Trump, and they clashed. And of course, we saw the tragedy of the woman who passed away because of those clashes. And so over the course of the Trump presidency, sort of mirroring what's happening in the Arab context, we've seen these large protest movements claiming to speak on behalf of the people, often targeting a populist leader who also claims to speak on behalf of the people. And so now we're going to transition into talking about some of the rhetorical similarities of the populist leaders' rhetoric, specifically, not just the similarities in the context. And so I'll turn it back over.
Okay. One of the tactics that have been used on both the American and the Arab side is naming and labeling enemies. Giving your own enemy certain names as a stigma, as a way to stigmatize them and to really show them like, oh, we are the bad guys and we are the good guys, creating some kind of polarization among the people. And when I talk about polarization, I also have to mention the connection to the role of social media. When you have a moment of solidarity where all the people are united behind a certain cause, like for example, Mubarak must go, irhal, 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 you have to go from office, you have to leave, and everybody is united, white, dark skin, men, women, rich, poor, old, young, you name it, Islamist, secular, everybody is united behind this great moment of unity and solidarity. Social media plays a very important role to unite the people and bring them together. And vice versa, if you have division and if you have fragmentation and polarization, which is pretty much the case in many parts of the Arab world, and I would say also in the United States, in the American context as well, social media in this case plays the exact opposite effect. It's going to increase the distance between the self and the other, widen the gap and increase the distance, and create even more polarization and even more fragmentation and division. And these are real cases that we are seeing in both the Arab and the American contexts equally. So the polarization is very important. And the polarization actually makes the populist leader stronger because he can play people against each other. So he's going to play on this whole technique of naming and labeling enemies as a way to also say, you see, I am the good one, I'm the good one, I'm the good guy, they are the bad guys, and to increase this kind of polarization, which even gives him more power and more strength as a populist leader. In the case of the American context, you have this whole notion of the people versus the elite. So you have, for example, Donald Trump always talking about, oh, I am the anti-establishment president, right? I am not from the establishment, I'm from outside the establishment. Drain the swamp, all of this kind of rhetoric that he used in order to say, oh, I am one of the people. I'm not one of the people who are quote unquote the elite. Although, of course, we know that he is a billionaire. So at the same time, you have the people versus the foreign foes or foreign enemies in the context of the Arab world, right? This whole notion we talked about before, when we talked about Nasserism, we talked about the notion of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-Zionism, and there remains to be this kind of rhetoric of really trying to say, we are different and we have foreign enemies, we should always be careful. This whole notion of we have to maintain our stability because otherwise our foreign enemies are going to eat us alive. They're going to really kind of attack us. So there is some kind of similarity, but there is also some kind of difference, which is the whole point of our research, to show the similarities as well as the differences, the overlaps and the divergences between the populist context in both the Arab and the American contexts. So one of the tactics used being naming and labeling enemies. Of course, in the case of Trump, you have the kind of words that he used, right? So things like, calling, Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, calling Hillary Crooked Hillary, Sleepy Joe, Little Rocket Man about the president of North Korea. He even also labels groups, right? Like the radical left. He talks about, the angry Democrats. He talks about Antifa. He talks about the Mexicans those who are coming from, Latin American countries as drug dealers and criminals and rapists. Not to mention, of course, Islam hates us and all of this rhetoric that has been really a driving force behind the rise of Islamophobia and hate speech. And now we are seeing, of course, his language even of talking about the Chinese virus, causing to all of this hatred and discrimination against Asian Americans. So by the way, words really matter, and the kind of populist rhetoric which is being used can be very harmful to different groups, whether they are immigrants, Latinos, Muslims, Asian Americans, or others. In the case of Arab autocrats, there is always this notion of conspiracy and collusion, right? Other countries are coming after us. We have to be careful because we have foreign enemies, right? If you don't follow me and if you don't follow my lead, you're gonna see the same destiny that's gonna happen in other countries that have been torn apart, like, you know, like Iraq, like Syria. So there is always this kind of reference to conspiracy and collusion, and the reference also to external enemies and external plotters. Mubarak, for example, when the uprisings erupted in 2011, he said about the protesters, this is a plot which was executed by internal and external forces. The protesters were manipulated by some groups to spread violence and anarchy in the country. So basically, this notion of conspiracy theory has always been used by Arab autocrats and authoritarian rulers in order to try to make people scared and afraid. And when you are scared and afraid, I'm going to step up as your quote unquote protector, and I'm going to be the one who's going to protect you and give you this kind of shield against your internal and external enemies. And of course, we see in this kind of rhetoric also the stigmatization of these protesters as a minority, as those who are traitors. You know, they're engaged in treason, in foreign conspiracy, and the same language has been used by successive leaders and rulers throughout the Arab world. Also, presidents like Assad and Sisi talking about enemies of the people, talking about traitors, enemies of the state, foreign agents, misguided minority, terrorists. These are all terms and labels that have been attached to the opponents of the regime internally and externally, those who are opposing from inside the country, opposing from the diaspora outside the country, those who are opposing online, offline, you name it. They've all been given these kinds of names and labels by these autocratic rulers and the regimes in different parts of the Arab world, which we actually say in our own research, this is a form of populist rhetoric, which is effectively being used and deployed by these leaders in order to solidify their own positions of power and their own legitimacy vis-a-vis the protesters and activists and opponents that they always profile using these bad terms and these negative connotations and this kind of derogatory language.
And then, of course, we also have other tactics, right? And this is alluded to as well. So if we're looking at populism as a political style, it's a rhetorical style, then we're not just interested in the ways in which politicians describe the people and the people's relationship to other groups of people. We're also interested in the way they describe and depict their relationship to the people. And so one of the most common strands that we've seen looking across different cultural contexts has been the ways in which these populist leaders build themselves up as a protector of the people specifically. And so there's a long history in the United States, in the US context, of the president being seen in multiple different roles, maybe as a national priest, as a national leader, as someone who can sort of speak for the people, as perhaps the sort of symbolic representation of the nation, or the model American. But here we see a different type of persona being built alongside those sort of longer standing motifs of presidential rhetoric. With Trump, we saw him building himself up as the protector of the people. So in 2016, of course, he said, "I'm the law and order candidate" multiple times over the course of his campaign. During the last election cycle, especially during his July 4th address from Mount Rushmore, he described himself as someone who would talk about what is great about America, protect the American people from COVID, protect the American people from China, and all these different threats. And so part of what's going on within Trump's rhetorical universe was this constellation of threats and groups that were a threat to the people, and then putting himself up as the one who would defend the people from these threats. And so another aspect of this was whenever he described during the 2020 election, one of his final speeches, he talked about how his audience was the elite. You're the elite, you're the true elite, not the people who think they're the elite. And we saw an ad go around on social media with Trump where he said, they're really trying, when they target me, they're really trying to target you. And it showed him as almost like absorbing bullets or absorbing weapons being directed at the American people, with himself as the shield protecting the American people. And so this is all over Trump's populist rhetoric, these symbols. And another aspect of this is his description of the security service in hagiographic language. So praising them constantly, talking about how we have the best police, we have the best military, the strongest military ever. These sorts of exaggerative turns of phrase worked to build the military up in his own universe of discourse, even though a lot of the military leadership didn't like Trump and actually spoke out against Trump, especially Jim Mattis when he left office. But in talking about the military constantly and describing himself as the people's protector, Trump, again, who has no record of military service, tried to portray himself as the people's protector. And so it's interesting how this continued description of himself as a source of protection, as a source of power, and then uplifting of the actual sources of power and protection in American society work together to form a coherent whole, to sort of construct a protector persona for him in the public arena. And this is something we see also in other contexts.
Right. So if you look, for example, at the Arab context, we're going to see some parallels here. So, for example, Mubarak for a long time said his famous statement, it's either me or chaos, ana aw al-fawda. In other words, if I don't stay in power, if I'm not, quote unquote, the protector of the people, so to speak, you're going to end up in chaos. The same language and the same rhetoric has been used by other populist leaders in the Arab world. We saw, for example, President Sisi talking about, don't listen to anyone except me. You have to listen to me alone. I'm the only one who has the wisdom. So all of these leaders are really trying to profile themselves or show themselves in this position of authority and power as the shield, as the protectors of the people against any kind of harm. And of course, this whole notion of basically, do you want to be like Syria? Do you want to be like Iraq? You better have stability. So in other words, there's a trade-off between asking for your rights or asking for freedom and maintaining what they describe as quote unquote stability. So they always kind of privilege this whole notion of maintaining the status quo, keeping calm, keeping stability as a way to quote unquote protect the people from any kind of harm, not reaching a bad situation, for example, like civil war in Syria or the terrible situation in Iraq and so on. So basically the language here is a populist rhetoric, which tries to put the president or the person in power or the person in charge as the protector of quote unquote the people as a way to maintain legitimacy and to maintain control. And these leaders try to profile themselves as if they have monopoly over power and monopoly over the truth. They're the only ones who have the wisdom, they have the answers to all questions, and they have a monopoly over power and a monopoly over the truth.
And so we've been talking about the parallels, right, between the context and the rhetorical similarities between these different forms of populism. Now we want to speak a little bit to the divergences as well.
Right, and one of these is some of the paradoxes we want to highlight here. So I'll talk about paradox number one. Basically, Trump uses social media to appeal to quote unquote the people. But social media also illustrated the disunity of the people. In other words, there's really some kind of sometimes a cacophony, if you will, in the realm of social media. You can have multivocality, you can have so many different voices speaking up. Some are with him, some are against him. So although he is really using social media, or he was using social media, because as we know, Twitter even closed down his Twitter account, and his Instagram account and other social media accounts have been closed down because of spreading disinformation and misinformation and inaccurate facts and figures. Really, what we are seeing here is Trump trying to use social media as a populist leader, trying to appeal to the people or the base. But at the same time, social media is not the best vehicle to accomplish this mission because of this kind of multivocality and this kind of divergence and this kind of disunity that can happen in the realm of social media. This is very different from the case in Arab countries or the Arab world, where you have state control and sometimes state monopoly. State-controlled media are an excellent vehicle for populist leaders to reach out to the masses. And we saw the example of Nasser. When we talked about Gamal Abdel Nasser, we talked about Nasserism, we talked about how he deployed the media, whether we're talking about newspapers, whether we're talking about Voice of the Arabs, the radio station, whether we're talking about television. These types of state-controlled media are an excellent vehicle for populist leaders to try to really kind of solidify their power, their authority, and make sure that they are, quote unquote, the only voice that is being heard by the people, and try to maintain more control over them. Of course, now we have competition. For example, from satellite television channels, you have also the internet, you have social media, you have all of these platforms of alternative kind of media and information that can reach to the people. But at the same time, the idea of still having this terrain or still having this arena of state-controlled media is definitely an advantage for Arab authoritarian dictators and populist leaders that populist leaders in the West, including the United States, do not enjoy.
And again, Trump is a nationalist populist leader, which means that one of the primary motifs of his rhetoric, as we talked about, is this deep anti-establishmentarian strain. And so because Trump portrays himself as against the establishment, likes to rail against different forms of the establishment, especially the media, this means that Trump alienated a lot of the media, whether it was CNN or other news networks. And because of that, he had to rely on social media. The problem with that, again, like we just pointed out, is by focusing on an internal foe to the nation, and paradox number two, by building up a group within the United States as the enemy or the opponent of the people, and then trying to galvanize the rest of the nation against that set of people. Doing that in a way where he relied on social media, again, just turned into a double-edged sword, because every time he tries to rally people on social media, every time he tried to speak on behalf of the people circumventing traditional media channels, it then just took place on a platform where he was able to be responded to that, again, revealed the empirical disunity of the people. And this is a problem that didn't necessarily face Arab authoritarian leaders in the same way. And so because they're operating in an Arab nationalist tradition, the leaders that we've spoken about, Sisi, Assad, Gaddafi, others, they're primarily focused on labeling groups internal to the nation still, their political opponents, but associating them with outside powers and describing them as outside agents. And so there's not necessarily the same dynamic where you're trying to rally a group of the nation against another group of the nation, alienating that group and then having them have the ability to speak back. Rather, because there is this condition where there's state-controlled media, even though it is not perfect control, obviously. It is a situation where the fact that you have one group focusing in the American context on internal enemies and the other group focusing on external orientation of the populist rhetoric in the Arabic-speaking world, you have divergent outcomes on that level, because you're not, the populist leader isn't necessarily overtly trying to demonize a group within the nation. And again, this gets back to the major constraints here. And so it's not just on a rhetorical level that there's this paradox, it's also on a legal level. And it's important to remember that for all of the things that have happened in the United States over the past few years, not a single member of the New York Times editorial board was a Trump supporter. Not even sort of the token conservatives on that editorial board. And so because of that, it's important to keep in mind that Trump was never able to shrink the sphere of public debate in the same way that we've seen happen in these other more autocratic states. For example, in Egypt, General Sami Anan was jailed for 2 years simply for putting his name into the election in 2018 to run against Sisi. Whereas in the United States, General Jim Mattis, after he was Secretary of Defense, wrote this long-form essay in The Atlantic denouncing Trump, calling him a liar, and all sorts of things. And so a major factor to keep in mind here isn't just the rhetorical dissimilarities, but the relationship between that rhetoric and the actual legal and political constraints of the larger governing systems. And so the fact that there are different centers of checks and balances in American politics, the fact that there are different ways that groups can voice their opposition without fear of being quote unquote disappeared or other things like that happening to them means that it's very, very difficult for a populist leader, especially one that doesn't have the support of really any major institutions, whether it's academia or the media or entertainment or other institutions, to be able to successfully prosecute a populist rhetorical campaign and win and wield political power in an effective way.
Exactly. So in order to conclude, we want to talk about the paradoxes of populism. We talked a lot about the parallelism. We talked about the historical context. We talked about the rhetorical similarities. We talked about the techniques that are being used by leaders in both the Arab and the American context. We talked about how they're trying to play people against each other. They take advantage of fragmentation, of polarization, all of these factors. But the fact remains that there are certain divergences as well. And some of these divergences are in the contextual and the structural makeup of these societies. So in other words, like Randall just mentioned, you have the checks and balances in the American system. You have the separation of powers. You don't have that in the Arab world. You have more consolidation of power in the hands of the quote unquote authoritarian or populist leader. You have the state controlled media. You don't have the amount of freedom of expression or freedom of the press, which is available in the Western context, which really provides alternative spaces to contest and to kind of, disagree with the leader, if you will, and even voice your opinion without the possibility of going to jail or being, disappeared or forcibly disappeared or arrested or killed for doing so. So we have to ask certain questions. Is there potential insufficiency of populist rhetoric alone, right? This is an important point. Populist rhetoric can only take you so far. but it cannot really kind of flip things completely, in real life or on the ground. For example, if you take the example of the Arab world, when we talk about the structural and contextual constraints, right? You can talk about protest movements on the ground, you can talk about revolutionaries, but the fact is the deep state remains in many of these countries, it is still alive and well. The slogan that people raised back in 2011, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, the people want to overthrow the regime, did not turn into a reality in the post-Arab Spring countries, maybe with the unique exception of Tunisia, that showed an example of a smooth transition of power and successful peaceful coalition building. All the other countries are in a very difficult situation. So basically, we need to have some kind of real change on the ground, and that needs a structural and contextual kind of action that has not been taking place in the context of the Arab world. The deep state is still alive and well, as I mentioned, and you actually have limitations also in terms of these populist movements and in terms of the protest movements as well, because the fact remains that you have a vacuum in many of these Arab societies that cannot be filled by protesters alone or cyber activism alone, or even both of them. In other words, if you have a vacuum of an inactive civil society, you don't have enough NGOs, you don't have enough political opposition movements. I mean, real opposition movements, not just de facto or decorative opposition movements, but real ones, not just tame opposition, but real opposition. When all of that is absent, you cannot fill it with just a demonstration or a protest on the ground or cyber activism online. And these are some of the most important differences and divergences between the Arab and the American context. Also, the importance of the enemy against which the people are configured in populist political discourse. We saw this whole notion of the internal enemies in the case of the American context and the external enemies in the case of the Arab context. Again, this kind of rhetoric can only take you so far, because at the end of the day, there are rhetorical parallels, but there are a lot of actual authoritarian divergences, and that is the main key point and argument of our co-authored research. Thank you so much, and we're ready to take your questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And we have a few questions from the audience. The first one, it's a couple of related questions from John Maldine. How exactly is populism detrimental to democratic governance, and what can be done to counter the effects of populism, both in the short and the long term?
Yeah, I want to start, and Randall, you can join, if that's okay with you.
Okay. Yeah.
I believe that one of the most important things that are really dangerous about populism or populist leaders is when they try to, quote unquote, play people against each other, which is one theme that we touched upon in our presentation. This whole notion of deep polarization and deep fragmentation and playing of this sentiment of playing people against each other, is a very dangerous one. And we saw that in both the Arab context as well as in the American context, of course, despite in different ways, using different measures, different techniques, different styles, but the underlying theme or the underlying motivations were the same. There is also this notion of the leader being the person who, has all, knows all, is the authority, is the one who is in control. He has a monopoly over power, monopoly over authority. Don't listen to anyone except me, right? All of that stuff is quite dangerous, because really it kind of denies people the opportunity to think for themselves. And that's a very important point, because they don't have, in this case, the plurality or multiplicity of different voices and different views. I think that one of the best ways to counter populism is really kind of having a good awareness of what populism is in the first place, good education. And this is a very important point, because, for example, in the case of Trump, the Trump supporters, most of them are not college educated. It's a fact. And they believe a lot of the rhetoric that he just basically, spreads through social media and other platforms as a fact. When he says, the Chinese virus, when he talks about, the pandemic just going away, disappearing magically and all of that stuff, they just believe him. And the same applies to a lot of the rhetoric he has been using. The same applies in the Arab world as well. So I believe that good education, good awareness, making people understand what populism is, and having a good educational system is a very, very important protection against the rise of populism. Randall?
Certainly. So I think I would have three responses to that question. So first, populism isn't necessarily a unitary construct. And so that's something that our study reveals as well, that there are left-wing populisms and right-wing populisms and centrist populisms. And the point here is not so much that there is a monolithic thing called populism, but that this is a particular style through which different political leaders articulate their claims. And so looking at it from that perspective, I think one thing that we can really do, and this is the second point, is pay really close attention to the ways in which political leaders frame the people and frame themselves and who they're framing the people against, if they are framing the people against something. There's a tension in the American political system because we are a democratic republic, right? And so our leaders are supposed to speak on behalf of the people. They are supposed to be representatives of the people. But what can happen, sort of the shift from democratic rhetoric to populist rhetoric, might occur whenever we see polarization playing a major role in the articulation of their claims and sort of within their conceptual system of their rhetoric. And so one thing we can do, I think, sort of on the broad terms as a third point, again, because polarization is so key to different forms of populism and how appeals to democratic will mutate into populist appeals, one thing we can always try to do is understand other people across different lines, understand people different than us. And again, to reiterate what Dr. Khamis said, it's important to be educated, it's important to be informed. It's also important to approach people with an open mind and try to de-escalate our debates to the extent we can, because the higher tension there is and the more polarization there is, the easier it is for these types of appeals to feed off of that division.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Mike Thompson. Would you say populism is caused directly by the failures of a democratic government? Let me expand on these questions. I think they are related. Last year throughout the pandemic, for example, I think one of the things that happened was that while most, at least in the United States, while most smaller businesses had to close, there were companies like Amazon who actually profited a lot from the lockdowns because people rushed to buy everything online. So, we have a situation whereas if we have information, we can question the populist rhetoric. At least we can begin to see where some of the people who believe that are coming from, right? We are in a situation, we have been for decades, the economic gap has been increasing, and then the COVID lockdown starts, all smaller businesses have to close and are hurting really badly, whereas the big companies are profiting from it. Matter of fact, the stock market went up really high at the end of 2020. So is there a connection between that? And related to Mike Thompson's questions, is populism caused by the failures of a democratic government? And if so, what can center-right and center-left parties do or take away from the rise of populist movements?
Randall, you want to start first?
Sure. So again, this is a tension that existed within Western democracy since John Dewey, right? And the eclipse of the public, and talking about the ways in which we have such a complicated system of government and such a large federal apparatus that we rely on experts. And because we rely on experts, we see public will to some extent eclipsed because we're relying on the technocrats to run things. And so there's this tension, right? Because we have poor political outcomes or poor financial outcomes for the people. And I think a major component of de-escalating polarization, if that's sort of the broader goal here, is for people who, when they are in charge, to be humble and to admit when we get things wrong. I think there's a lot that we don't know about what's happened the past year. Certainly COVID and lockdowns have played a major role in perhaps sapping some of the legitimacy or some of the perceived expertise, because we've seen some policies where it was locked down. I think Britain is a good example of this, where the prime minister said, we're going to be open by Christmas. What are we talking about? We're not going to lock down. And then, of course, he had to reverse himself and then do that exact thing. So movements like that tend to detract from public confidence in experts and detract from public confidence in governance. I think you're absolutely right to the extent that the past year has seen a lot of times when experts got it wrong. At the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that we do need experts, right? And we do need people to be capable of running things, and that it's not just about people seeking their own advantage, or it's not like a pure class diagnosis here, but there are people who have real skills that are a huge advantage to our system of government and to companies, whatever sort of infrastructure or institution they're a part of, and they are able to use their skills. And that does benefit the society as a whole. So I think there's a tension there, right? Because obviously there are instances where public will has been sapped because of mismanagement. At the same time, I think those fears can at times be overblown, and it's also important to, again, encounter all these things in a spirit of humility.
I do agree with the notion that there are definitely certain constraints or failures in democratic systems that give a chance or maybe a loophole, we can put it this way, for some of these, populist leaders to grow and to flourish. But there are also certain things we did not have time to cover or to talk about in our presentation. This kind of rise of populism is really we have to put it in the right context. And the right context is also the rise in parallel other very important and alarming phenomena internationally, including white supremacy, right-wing movements, right-wing activism, and rhetoric, right? And that creates a climate of fear from the other, fear from immigrants, from minorities, Islamophobia, hatred of others, sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, you name it. The list can go on and on and on. And we are seeing this globally. We have seen it a lot in Europe, recently in the United States, and definitely alive and well in many other parts of the world. We cannot detach something like the phenomena of populism and the rise of populism from these other parallel phenomena that are sweeping many different parts of the world. I think they are closely interlinked and interrelated. Also, another very important point is the rise and the spread of misinformation and disinformation. That is very important. People can just go out and say whatever they want. They can use social media, which is really a double-edged sword. I always say social media is a double-edged sword. On one hand, you can have it spread, awareness, right, information, facts, and figures. But as we saw, for example, in the case of the coronavirus pandemic, very clearly, there is also the possibility of spreading fear and spreading misinformation and disinformation, lies, incomplete facts. And you end up with people who are afraid of taking the vaccine, people who are even denying the existence of the virus, saying, oh my God, it's a hoax, which is a term that former President Donald Trump actually used. He described it as a hoax. He said it's not true. It's going to just disappear, And all of that, of course, led to the horrible situation where we have more than 500,000 deaths in the greatest and richest country in the world, the United States. So I think we cannot divorce this notion of populism and the growth of populism from all of these other factors. I think that they are very much interlinked and interrelated.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Do you think democratic governance has a bright future from now? Or how do you consider internationally where we are going from now? Do you think populism is dangerously on the rise? Do you think the fact that we have a Biden administration changes anything about the trends? How do you see it internationally?
I will talk about the Arab context and leave the American context to Randall. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes. Enough? That's a good division of labor there, right? Mm-hmm. I think that in the Arab context, I definitely see this quote unquote tug of war and this kind of push and pull mechanism and this kind of tension. The Arab world has a very vast growing young population. More than 70 or 75% of the population in the Arab world are young people under the age of 30 or 35. You look at the Gulf region, and this percentage even jumps up to almost around 90%. So this is really huge. While you have, for example, in Europe, they call Europe now the old continent or the aging continent, because the population is really mostly aging and older people. So you have this young population in this part of the world. Many of them are now educated. Many of them are technologically savvy. They're using social media. They're quite, comfortable with using technology and social media. And therefore, they're really presenting a hope and a promise for the future. It is true that authoritarian leaders are not going to go away anytime soon. They're holding very strongly to their seats and to their power, using partly some of the populist techniques that we have been talking about and some of the strategies we have been talking about in our presentation today, and other tools and techniques, of course, in terms of repressive measures on the ground and jailing their opponents and going after them and all of that horrific stuff. But it's also true that we do see some light at the end of the tunnel. And I see the hope in the new generation and the young generation of Arab men and women who are becoming more technologically savvy and more educated and more, capable of also opening up to the rest of the world. One of my interviewees in one of my studies said that social media is like a window through which she can see the rest of the world while being seen by the rest of the world. So I think that gives us some kind of hope that there can be some kind of positive change coming soon. How soon is it coming? Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball and I cannot predict how soon this kind of change is coming, but I am optimistic that after a fight and after more, push and pull dynamics and tug of war, there will be some light at the end of the tunnel because of this new generation I just talked about now.
Yeah, so I think I might have 3 points to talk about. So first, as someone who studies presidential rhetoric, it's been almost a bit of whiplash going from the Trump presidency to the Biden presidency, because Biden just had he still hasn't had his first scheduled press conference. He's going to have it here shortly, whereas Trump was constantly in the media, constantly saying things, constantly sort of filling up everyone's attention. And so I think that's to the Biden administration's credit to speak to the question specifically about the Biden administration and de-escalating things. Whether one thinks that Biden has been a more centrist president or moderate or liberal or progressive, obviously that depends on one's political orientation. But I think speaking specifically as a communications scholar, clearly he's taken an approach where he's trying not to fill the news headlines with himself. And so that's certainly a major pivot that's worth noticing. Second, I think one of the things that actually I think is hard to divorce in the American context from these discussions of populism is the Iraq War, and the way that the Iraq War was an absolute disaster from a policymaking standpoint, from a regional stability standpoint, from a humanitarian standpoint, literally any perspective one takes on it. Certainly Saddam Hussein was a terrible leader and a tyrant. At the same time, there's no arguing that this has been a disaster on every level. And so a major component of that disaster has been the lack of public trust in the military and in national security leadership. I think one of the threats to American democracy that perhaps doesn't get as much press time is the fact that a lot of the military establishment doesn't necessarily talk about what they're doing all the time. And it's not necessarily apparent. There was a report that came out this week that apparently military leaders deceived President Trump about how many troops were in Afghanistan and in Syria at different points. And while Trump certainly as a populist leader might not have made the best decisions surrounding that, if that's a pattern that continues, that's something certainly to pay attention to make sure that we don't have that, to make sure that we do have democratic accountability of our national security forces. And then, of course, it's difficult to have this conversation about the health of American democracy outside the context of the global environment. Part of that is competition with China. Part of that is trying to decide what the United States wants to do with the rest of the world and what its relationship will be like with the rest of the world from the perspective of trade or diplomatic relations. I do think that something that gives me hope is the fact that there seems to be this tendency for people to restore this spirit of modeling what it looks like to be a democracy abroad. And so for most of American history, the American people weren't invested heavily militarily and diplomatically in other parts of the world, although the United States has always been an international presence since its inception. But for a long part of American history, we talked about the rest of the world and our relationship to it as that of a model, as someone who we need to have our own country in order, need to be a democratic exemplar, and we need to make sure our own house is in order before we go telling someone else what to do in their country. And so I think there is a lot of latent political desire within the American people for that kind of leadership and for that kind of message. We'll see if the Biden administration can deliver on that or if that's up to a future political leader. But I do think there's a lot of an appetite for that pivot. And so hopefully we'll see that materialize in the coming days, weeks, and years.
Well, we ran out of questions, but thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And we hope you'll join us in the next sessions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Goodbye.